guess we'll get started. Welcome to xTalks. This is a co-hosted event with xTalks Digital Learning from the Office of Digital Learning, as well as the MIT India program, and we're really thrilled to have Dr. LaMotta with us today. I have a few short announcements, and then I will hand the proceedings over to VP of Open Learning, Sanjay Sarma. We have some cards that are dispersed around the audience, as well as on the table here. They give information about upcoming xTalks in April, as well as the Link conference in May, which we're really excited about. If you don't mind, we'd love if you would sign in on the clipboard. It gives us a sense of who's here and what your interests are, and how we can better serve your interest and why you come here. So please sign in and let us know what's going on. You can also get on the xTalks mailing list that way. Just a few words about the video. We are videotaping today, so if for any reason you are uncomfortable being in the video, it will be posted and made available to the public. You can sit in the back row. That's also the reason why I am using this microphone and why Dr. LaMotta will use a microphone, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Sarma, is because it makes for a higher quality video in the final production, and we'll also ask you to use it when you do Q&A. So that's all the information I need to give you. I will hand the proceedings over to Dr. Sarma. Please give him a warm welcome.
Very much, it's a great honor for me to introduce Professor Shilin LaMotta. I met him a couple of years ago. I was in India giving a talk in education at the Indian Institute of Management, and I talked a little bit about the history of education, and Shailendra approached me and gave me this 3-minute lightning presentation on history. It was riveting and informative. And over the years, I've received articles from him, and I forwarded them to a few of our colleagues. And we've had a number of great conversations about education, design, philosophy, the history of education, and so on, particularly from an Indian perspective. Shailendra is a Delhi man like me. He went to St. Stephen's in Delhi, and then he went to the Delhi School of Economics. Then he went to Oxford. He got his PhD at Harvard. He was at Purdue as a professor there. He was at Duke. He moved to India about 10 years ago, and there he's had a number of really exciting and interesting roles. He's a visiting professor at IIM Ahmedabad, and also the chairman of the board of a new university that's being set up in India called the Oro University in Surat in Gujarat. I don't want to take too much more time, but I just want to say that in my world as vice president of Open Learning, one of the things we like to do at MIT is, we're not just purveyors of learning. If we're going to do learning, we like to do research. And research needs to be multifaceted. It needs to be, what is learning? How does the brain work? But equally importantly, what's the history of education? And it's fascinating to see that that history extends 2,600, 2,700 years. And I really look forward to hearing Shailendra present on this. Shailendra. Thank you.
You have your... No, I have this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be here. And what I intend to do today is walk you through the 2,600-year history of higher education at jet speed. This is something that I've been working on now for the past 4 years. It started with a very innocuous question, on which I have a paper that Sanjay was alluding to that some of you may be interested in. I'd be happy to send it to you. It is really my tribute to American universities, because I was educated here, as Sanjay indicated, and I taught in the United States for many years, and in many ways fell in love with the American university system. And I wrote a paper on why these universities are so good. I had a hunch that it had to do with their governance structures. And so my paper is really a study of the governance of the top 100 universities. I'll allude to it in one of the slides. But essentially, the answer that I came to as to why these universities are so good is because of the role of alumni, that whether they're public or private, religious or non-religious, they find a way to essentially have alumni as an integral part of the governance process. So then it started a process of asking a very simple question. So what were the other innovations in the history of education? And now I had been educated in Europe, so that part was relatively easy. But then it dawned on me that a large part of the history of higher education was in India. We had sort of been exposed to it in the most perfunctory fashion in our history books. But outside of India, nobody seemed to be aware of it. And even within India, most of us, that includes me, were largely unaware of what was accomplished. So over the past 4 years, furiously, I looked at, I've forgotten, 4 librarians basically fed my appetite for material now in 11 languages. This is almost hilarious, that for 6 primary languages, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Greek, Tibetan, and Chinese, and 5 secondary languages, including Hindi, Gujarati, English, French, and German. So for me, it has been a voyage of discovery, and it's for the first time that I'm presenting this material here. And I apologize if some of it may seem disjointed. I've tried to weave a thread through it. But every slide that I'm going to share with you has a huge amount of work that has been done behind it. And I'd be happy to share the flavor of that work. If you want to know what are the primary sources, for every slide there is a primary source, or several sources, or in some cases dozens of sources or more. And I'd be happy to share all of that. But for now, I want to share with you a very high-level overview of what I consider to be, so it's a very impressionistic point of view, but I'd like to believe well supported by the data of what really happened over 2,600 years. So, first of all, very quickly, the history of universities is about 2,600 years old, 1,800 years of which was when India was prominent in higher education, from roughly the 6th century BC to the 12th century AD. 700 years when Europe was prominent, starting roughly around the 12th century, late 11th, 12th. And 100 years when US has been prominent, early 20th century to now. But what is interesting is that so far I've not come across a single source, not a single source that looks at those 2,600 years as a whole. And remember, this is a critical institution. It always has been critical, but especially today, the universities have never been more critical. And what is interesting is that the problems that these universities faced were very similar. And in some cases, they reinvented the wheel in almost the same fashion as the previous innovation. So it's important to look at that. And I've already indicated how this started. So this is pretty interesting. This is the 4-volume definitive history of the university, as it claims, in Europe, a history of the university in Europe by Walter Reig, Cambridge University Press, 1992. And he makes a statement that I want to sort of put up here. The university is a European institution. Indeed, it is the European institution par excellence, etc. This is a common notion around the world, that the university is a European invention. I hope to give you sufficient data today to indicate that not only is it not so, that there is a history before that, but that in many ways Europe, pretty much in the same order, reinvented things that had already been invented and then destroyed. The tragedy of this higher education in India was that every one of these 7 institutions that functioned as a higher education system was destroyed violently at one point or the other. 5 of them, in fact, within one 3-month period that has variously been estimated as 1197 or 1205, but somewhere in that period, all 5 of the remaining ones were destroyed, and you can say that that is when India lost control of her own narrative. So very quickly, here are some names that you may have not seen, with one exception of Al-Azhar. But essentially, I want to share with you the kind of higher education institutions that existed before Europe. And I will walk you through the geography of all of this. So just give me a few minutes and I will contextualize this. But these are some names that you need to understand. The first university, which exhibits many of the key features that we associate with the university today, was Takshala, 6th century BC to 450 AD, when it was destroyed by the White Huns who came in from the north. And then a whole series of institutions in Greece, which are not really universities, because remember, When I go all over the world and say who invented the university, the Pavlovian response is the Greeks did it. But as you would know, if you reflected on it, that they didn't have anything close to a university. What they had were schools. You had the Platonic school, you had the Aristotelian Lyceum, and so on. And you had all of these schools, but these were schools of a particular doctrine. A university, by definition, and I will indicate this in a minute, is a place where everything under the sun is looked at. And then there were, when Takshila was destroyed, a whole series of institutions were set up further east to be a little bit safer. And these were Nalanda, which, by the way, is now in the process of being revived. Amartya Sen, as some of you may know, has been deeply involved with that effort. Vallabhi, Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Jagadal, Sompura. I will talk about these in a minute. And then in parallel in China, and by the way, again, I have not been able to find very much information about these Asian universities. In some cases, no more than a paragraph is available in the English language, nor, for that matter, has the scholarship in these countries really focused on what these universities really look like. But there were several of these in China that I'm not going to touch upon because very little is known about them. What is interesting is that about the Indian universities, more is known, not because the sources exist in India, but because of the sources that exist outside of India. That is because of the people who came there from all over the world and wrote about it. And of course, the oldest the oldest university which has a continuity is Al-Azhar in Egypt that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of. So here is the timeline for Europe and the United States. It's important to look at this. Bologna, 1088. By the way, 1088 is again a disputed number. So Walter Rieg points out in his history that in 1888, when Italy was trying to develop its own identity as part of the integration of the Italian states, they hit upon this number. They wanted to celebrate the 800th year of the founding of the university. So they literally, this was a date as plausible as many others. I mean, we don't really know. So they picked up this number. So many of these dates are uncertain. But what is certain is that by the late 11th century, a whole bunch of institutions in early 12th century, a whole bunch of institutions were being set up in Europe. And then Harvard, of course, in the United States, and a whole bunch of institutions set up in the 18th and the following centuries in the US. So this just gives you a timeline for what we have in mind, a very wide sweep. And what is ironic is that I have not seen this list put together anywhere, of essentially just looking at the timeline. So what is interesting is to contextualize this. And what I want to do is take you through what made it possible. So why is it that these universities occurred, were set up in India, and why in particular was it set up in Takshila? Where is Takshila? This is Takshila. This is India. This is the map of India. This is Pakistan here, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Tibet, China, all of these you know. Now, what is interesting is that around the 3rd century BC, well, actually, let me back up. Around the 6th century BC, the Persians created what was called the Royal Road, the Persian Royal Road, that is mentioned in the history of Herodotus, who mentions basically that this Royal Road stretched from Persepolis, which was the old capital of Iran, all the way up to the Greek coast here in Sardis, passing through Mosul, Baghdad, Ankara, and then Sardis on the Greek coast, which is where many of the refugees are crossing over. So this was the ancient Royal Road, and it was said, I think it's in some history somewhere, that a virgin could walk from Persepolis to the Greek coast unmolested with a pot of gold on her head, because these roads were so well protected, and there were checkpoints and rest spaces every couple of kilometers, and very well guarded. Now, what is interesting is that around the 3rd century BC, a similar road is in existence, if not earlier. As far as I know, The inspiration for this road came from the Persians, that an emperor in the 3rd century BC by the name of Chandragupta Maurya built a similar royal road which connected Gopalpur in Orissa with Calcutta here, with Patliputra or Patna here, with Allahabad, with Meerut, Delhi, Amritsar, Lahore, and Takshala. It comes up here, Herat, Kandahar, then Persepolis. So basically, essentially, Chandragupta Maurya builds this circuit. And he builds, in the 3rd century BC, the largest empire that the world has known up until that point. And what is interesting is that he is, as a boy, he's supposed to have met Alexander in Takshala. We know this from Plutarch's lives, that Alexander and Takshala met. Alexander and Chandragupta Maurya met here in Takshala. And it's interesting that Alexander tried to conquer India and then retreated. And Chandragupta Maurya unifies the states essentially as a response to the Greek challenge. So this is the information superhighway of the first millennium, right? This is the reason why Takshala here is so prominent, because 3 major roads come together. The North Indian Royal Road, which comes here, the Persian Royal Road, which also comes here, and very shortly, the Silk Route is created, which goes from Tashkent, Samarkand, Dunhuang, and then the old capital of China, Xi'an, where you have the terracotta warriors. So these 3 roads meet at Takshala. So Takshala is, if you like, the global junction point. And what I did, it took me a day to create this map. Again, nobody, as far as I know, has put these 3 roads together. But parts of this, I mean, these have been well studied by historians. So I essentially went back to the sources, the historical sources, and literally mapped it city by city. What is interesting is that these roads are still the major highways of their respective countries. In particular, this Royal Road, which used to be called Uttarapath, or the Northern Road, is still National Highway number 1 in India, if you can believe it. So for 2,300 years, this road has been in use, at least, if not more. And similarly, all these roads have important numbers in the highway system of their respective countries. So very quickly, I'm going to take you through some other slides. So anyway, you've seen this. By the way, this is interesting, that the Persians, Herodotus says that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Do you recognize this motto somewhere? US Post Office. So it's taken from there, by the way. So, and by the way, the reason for that is interesting. The architect who created the post office in New York, he was the son of a classicist, a Greek scholar. So he grew up reading his father's Greek texts. And so he chose this motto, which was then approved by the post office. So all these things I just found out in the process of looking at this. Anyway, so now this is something that is important. The world population, Angus Maddison, his OECD work from 2001, looks at the long-term population numbers. And what is interesting is that the population of the world around the turn of the millennium, 0 BC, AD, whatever you may call it, was 230 million. Asia had 171 million people at that time. If you look at the population shares, it's absolutely astounding. India, in the first 1,000 years, from 0 to 1000 AD, had somewhere around 1/3 of the population. China was actually smaller at that time. The world GDP shares are even more revealing. These are the actual GDP numbers. The GDP of the world in 0, somebody actually went and calculated this, is about 102 billion. And the population shares are even more revealing. 1/3 of the world's GDP around 0 AD is in India. Even around 1000 AD, it's 28.9%. China is close by. So you can see why the whole world wanted to come to India at that point. More importantly, if you compare it with the other nations that have been dominant, France reached its peak in 1870, Britain in 1870 as well, at 6.5 and 9.1% respectively. Germany is 8.8 in 1913. USA and the Soviet Union reached their peak in terms of percentage shares in 1950. And this gives you a sense of the long-term economic dynamics. And this is also reflected in this diagram that I've taken from the McKinsey Global Report on the urban world. If you look at many of you are engineers here, you would appreciate that if you look at the economic center of gravity, in 1 CE, it was right around Takshila. See, this is the border of India. This is Takshila. And it moves obviously steadily westward. This coincides with the power of the US in 1950. And then by 2025, it's coming back there. I think no slide captures the long-term economic dynamics as well as this particular slide. Now, so located at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago is the sculpture by Howard Hunt, which is Y. The sculpture is called Y. The reason why I mention this is because the first people in the world who asked why, that is the philosophers, were in India. Again, when I go around the world, and by the way, I'm taking this from Ben Ami Scharfstein's History of Philosophy. He's a professor, or used to be a professor emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he's written this very fine work on comparative philosophy. Now, what is interesting is that the first people in the world to ask why were not the Greeks, but they were the Indians. And what is interesting even more is that the first 4 people to engage in a recorded philosophical debate were Uddalak Aruni, his student Yagyavalkya, Yagyavalkya's wife, way for them to attend by supporting them financially. That is what MIT does. That is what all the great American universities try and do. You try and build the best possible class, not on the basis of their ability to pay, which is what would happen in the marketplace, but on the basis of their ability to contribute and absorb. Secondly, public goods. You're producing knowledge, which is free, shared with everybody. And there is asymmetric information. Now, actually, wait. So I was going to have a quote from Plato. Asymmetric information, I have it somewhere. It's coming up later. I think the slides are out of order here. Plato says that education is different because of asymmetric information. He said, if you buy a piece of food and you think that it is not of the highest quality, you can return it. You can return it fairly quickly because you can figure out whether that food stinks, literally and figuratively, fairly quickly. But he said, education is not like that. By the time you figure out that it's not a good education that you've gotten, it's too late. The damage has been done to your soul. And in the US, fortunately, the problem is not as severe, though the problem of asymmetry remains. There are many people from disadvantaged communities who really don't know which is the best fit for them in terms of universities. And this is in spite of so much of publicly available information here in this country. But think of the problem in India where you have universities deliberately obfuscating information, gaming the system. A little bit of that happens here also, but much more happens outside of the United States, so it becomes a huge problem. So anyway, I will come back to this. So let me walk you through the series of innovations that I'm going to talk about in India, in Europe, and the United States. 16 of them from India, the same 16 were repeated in Europe, and Europe adds 3 more. And then all of these are taken over in the US, and the US adds 3 more. And I would argue that these 22 innovations are what one should look at. So I will very quickly walk you through this. Yeah, this is the quote from Plato. So the first key point, this is the very definition of a university, right? A university, by its name, is under one roof, the place where everything under the sun is studied. Universitas, or in Sanskrit, Vishwavidyalaya, or a Mahavihar. Now, for Takshila, the university that I talked about, these are the subjects that are mentioned. Now, where do we find the mention of these? It turns out that there are 547 stories about the birth of the Buddha. 105 of them mention Takshila, 97 of them in an educational context. So what I did is I did a statistical study of these 547, identify the 105, and these are tales, right? They're not really about education, but they're about people who get an education in Takshala. So they indicate what is it that this person studied, how much did he pay, what did he do when he came back, and by the way, at this point they were all men. That changes, I will talk about it. So what they did is that they talk about all of these, and what is interesting is that the 4 core subjects of theology, of law, liberal arts, and medicine, which by the way were the 4 key subjects for Europe. For the core of the university in Europe consisted of these 4 subjects. That was present right at the beginning, and everything else that was known at that time. A big part was military science. So what are you doing? I'm going to study military science at Takshala, is a standard refrain that you see in these stories. There's also a very prominent medical school, and I had a chance to go to Takshala, to the museum, and this slide is actually taken from there, but actually via a paper by Naqvi, who's a Pakistani doctor practicing in Britain. These are some of the medical instruments, basically, that surgical instruments that were excavated around from the 3rd century BC. Many of them having to do with the extraction of a stillborn fetus. And what is interesting is that this is a gruesome looking instrument, but actually used by surgeons even today to extract a dead fetus. And these are very similar to the modern instruments that are being used. So he compared it. I won't go through this comparison. It was a pretty sophisticated medical school. So apart from surgery pertaining to gynecology, another very prominent one, I will not have the chance to talk about it here, was eye surgery, cataract surgery. And there are huge laudatory references in the Chinese literature, including one from a 7th century poet who said that the surgeons in India, and from Takshala in particular, are the ones who have bestowed a second life to me, because they have made me see. They made me able to see, they've made me capable of seeing something that I was losing the ability to see. So then these institutions were residential. In Takshala, they were all residential, with a few exceptions of day scholars. They were global. The kinds of people who visited there, you'd be surprised. Alexander, you can look it up in Plutarch's Lives. He goes to Takshala to learn from the philosophers. He goes looking for the philosophers, and in Plutarch, the recreation of the dialogue that he has with the philosophers is there. Democritus, almost certainly he went to Takshala. Democritus is known as the father of Greek atomic theory. If you look up your chemistry textbooks, his name comes up. He was there almost certainly at Takshala, and you know what? He almost certainly picked up the atomic doctrines of Nyaya Vaisheshik that were available there. Apollonius of Tyana, perhaps even St. Thomas, one of the early apostles of Christ, passed through Takshala. And within India, the Chandragupta Maurya, the emperor, Kautilya, who wrote the first textbook on economics, Arthashastra, and on political economy, Panini, the linguist that Noam Chomsky, eulogizes, Charaka, the foundation text for Ayurveda, the Indian system of medicine, all of these are there. Peer review. Now, again, there's no direct evidence in the university system, but I mentioned Charak, who wrote the textbook on medicine. There's a quote from there about a medical conference, and these are the participants who are there. And it says that the 5 theses were approved in this medical conference. And what is interesting is that when that was done, the word that is used, and I put the actual Sanskrit here, is sadhu, aho sadhu. Aho sadhu means congratulations and well done. That is exactly what my thesis supervisor told me when I got my thesis. So it's kind of interesting that the same peer review process was happening. And by the way, I will talk about this in the context of Europe, that the peer review process was happening outside of universities, and the universities brought it in. Case-based reasoning. So again, there is no scientific method per se, but what is Janardhan Ganeri, who's done a study of Indian logic, has indicated that case-based logic was developed in medicine and legal reasoning, and that takes you a lot of the way towards developing a true scientific method. What is interesting is that now with genetics coming in, the same logic will have to be expanded, because this is really about how do you talk about treating a population of 1, n is equal to 1 with your unique genome, how will you treat it? That has always been the approach of the Indian and the Oriental medical systems. Financial assistance, very interesting, because again, these teachers realized that they wanted to put the best class together. There is reference after reference that even in the 6th century BC, meritorious students who didn't have the money to pay, by the way, it was privately financed at that point, the teacher found two ways to deal with it. He would say, either pay me later when you become rich and famous, or you can do a work study program that you can work, you can help me with my chores and my teaching in the daytime, and I will also teach you in the evening or at night. So that is there. Then what is interesting is that later on, these 6 universities, after Takshila was destroyed, they have public funding. What they do is that the state supports it fully, and the model is very interesting. For Nalanda, which at its height had 1,500 faculty and 8,500 students, which we know from Chinese sources, the Chinese travelers who were there, that it was supported by the land revenue of 200 villages. So the way in which the king financed his expenditure was through 1/6 of the tax on produce. So essentially what would happen is that the universities would be given a charter saying that these villages, the land revenue, the tax, rather than going to the king, comes to the university. So what is interesting is that the king of Java gifts 5 of these villages. So what he does is he sends a large quantity of gold to the king and says, this is the net present value of these 5 villages. You take this one-time lump sum payment, and for the rest of history, you basically just give the land revenue of these 5 villages. So there are kings from Indonesia at that point who are supporting this. And what is even more interesting is that they also developed endowments. And I will touch upon that as to why this came about. It was called Akshaya Nidhi, that is the endowment that does not decay. And it is the same idea that is formalized later on, the idea of an eleemosynary corporation. Now, why did this happen? Now, why was this happening? So how come these universities were created in India? The reason is that the first, again, this has not been looked at. Again, I stumbled upon this, and it was just an eye-opener that the first corporation, the earliest corporation that exists even to this day is the Buddhist monastery. 2,500 years old. And essentially, the rules of that were laid down very clearly by the Buddha over 45 years. And you can read those rules even today as to how they should function. And these same monasteries became the nucleus of the universities. And so essentially, the charter of those universities, and again, it's a fascinating story. And in fact, some historians have even speculated that there were Buddhist monasteries in Egypt and the Middle East around the 2nd century BC, that some of the Christian monastic traditions, in particular the first Christian monastery set up by the Benedictines in 529 AD, may have taken some of these from there. So these were corporations, and this is actually a replica of the seal that was that was created by the king to memorialize the gift of 5 villages by the king of Sumatra. These universities had a system of degrees that they gave. You can recognize some of these words: Acharya, Upadhyaya, Pandit, and Mahapandit. They were knowledge repositories. At Nalanda, there were 3 libraries, 9 stories high. The Chinese traveler describes it as beyond, the spires were in the clouds. They had admission standards, and the way in which it functioned. By the way, you need to have selection, right? You don't want to let everybody in. You want the brightest group of individuals that you can find. So Nalanda had a very daunting criterion. You could only get into the university if you met an exam, if you met an entrance test at the entrance. It was literally an entrance test. That when you arrived at the door of Nalanda, you were met by one of the senior most professors who gave you a quiz on the spot. And you can imagine, trying to get admission to MIT by trying to get past its most famous professors right at the beginning, say with an interview by Noam Chomsky, it would be pretty daunting. Most people would not even dare. But even of those who dared, the selection, this is Yi Jing, the Chinese traveler, he says the selection rate was 10 to 20%. In Vikramshila, it was even more interesting. The 6 senior-most professors were assigned to one of the 6 gates. They were called the Dwar Pandits, that is, the gate professors. So just as you have university professors here, who are the most eminent at Vikramshila were the gate professors. All this is, deep evidence for this. These universities competed with each other. There were 7 of them and many centers, many smaller centers. So there was competition just as there is in the United States and there was in Europe. Now this is absolutely interesting, academic freedom. Now before I come to it, in 1794, Immanuel Kant is accused by the king of distorting the teaching of the Holy Scripture. And he defends himself in a book called The Conflict of Faculties and asks for the faculty to discuss, debate, and write according to the best of their knowledge and conscience. Now this is 18th century, late 18th century. By contrast, this is 11th century, a Tibetan eyewitness account of a morning congregation at Vikramshila. Several thousand academics are in attendance. The king is there in the audience. Nobody rises when the king comes. But when the senior-most academics come, everybody rises, including the king. Stunning. This is from 1893. There's a translation in an obscure journal that I found of an eyewitness Tibetan account, which indicates this basically. So what is interesting is that these universities had the freedom, free from the state, to discuss, as Zhuan Chang said, all possible and impossible doctrines. Religious, secular, scientific, philosophical, no limitations. And what is interesting is that the state had no religion. The king had a religion which may have been different from that of the monastery. And many Hindu kings supported Buddhist monasteries and vice versa. But this was that. Now this is actually a photo, a painting of the vice chancellor of Nalanda and Vikramshila. For a while he held dual charge. His name was Atish Dipankar. The king of Tibet sends a mule full of gold to entice him to come to Tibet. Of course, he gives the gold to the Nalanda and Vikramshila monastery and then goes and spends 12 years in Tibet doing that. Very interesting. Women's education. Vallabhi in the West, it was founded by 3 women. 3 women, one of whom was of royal birth, and one was a merchant woman, and the third one was a nun. And Vallabhi became a very prominent center that many of the Chinese visited. And what is interesting is that there were separate colleges, and this is known in the epigraphic evidence. So it's hard evidence, literally, in stone, carved in stone. And all castes, religions, and regions free to join. Centralized structure. So here now, unlike Takshila, like universities in modern times, there is one university that gives unified degrees, that has different faculty, that has different subjects. Now, I will very quickly, because this is now familiar territory, the European system adds the scientific method. So by the way, the scientific method is developed outside of the university in Europe. It is not developed within the university. It is developed by amateurs, it's developed by learned societies, it is developed by people experimenting alone. And so that is one major thing that is developed outside the university and that is brought into the university system. That is a major advance. Then Humboldt in 1818, when he sets up the University of Berlin, unifies teaching and research. So he says basically now reward should be given for scholarship, not just scholarship, but for actual creation of knowledge. And then learned societies and journals, peer review, formal repository in the form of journals, that is also European innovation. And then the US adds 3 more, unitary governance, meaning the president, under guidance from the board of trustees, has full control over the university on all non-academic matters, on all matters of money, for example. Alumni governance, I already alluded to it. And then what I call, what the economist has called the best single piece of legislation in the United States in the last 50 years, the Bayh-Dole Act, which allows universities to commercialize research funded by public systems. So anyway, scientific method, unity of research, learned societies, unitary governance. It's not going forward. Yeah. Okay, I will not talk about alumni governance, except to just show you this table, which is what sparked this off. If you look at the top 20 universities in the US, with one exception, that is Caltech at 40%, the boards of top US universities are almost exclusively comprised of alumni. And this, I believe, is what makes the US system so good. I'm happy to share with you the details of this if you are interested. So anyway, this is a quick summary. And so what about the future? Very quickly in 2 minutes, and then I really want to open it up for Q&A. So remember, the university over 2,600 years has survived all these technologies. It started at a time when the traditions were more oral than written. Then writing comes in. Palm leaves, paper, books, radio, TV, internet. The problems that the university is trying to solve, I hope in my lightning survey, I've tried to show you that the problems that they were trying to solve were very similar, even 2,600 years ago, because of the economic logic of what this is all about. And essentially, the process is about how do you select the best people? So if I were to summarize these 22 points, this is almost the final slide. How do you select people? How do you support them? And how do you transform them? Now, this is where I want to just close with something very interesting. If you look at the origins of the university, they lie in either philosophy or spirituality or religion. Now, the Greeks basically had a process called askesis, which was the process of essentially transforming oneself. Now, what is not very well known is that every school of Greek philosophy, the Cynics, the Pyrrhonians, the Stoics, the Platonists, all of them had their own tradition of meditation, not religion, of meditation. And this was designed to transform. And the person who's written most about this, apart from the scholar, perhaps the finest scholar of Greek in the last 50 years, Pierre Hadot at Collège de France, was of course Michel Foucault, who in the last couple of years of his life got back to the mission of philosophy, which is to transform. And so the final thought that I want to leave you with is that universities should be places that should not lose sight of their original mission. That we are here not just to educate, but we are here to transform and enable people to get in touch with who they are. And MOOCs, again, I was hoping to talk a little bit about MOOCs, but I really want to leave time for Q&A. Happy to respond to that. There are ways in which MOOCs can respond to these core functions of the university and the core layers that have been built up that I'm happy to sort of share with you based on my current thinking. But at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions.
I've got to tell you something funny. So my last name, as you know, is Sharma, which is Sharman in ancient India. And a couple of Sharmans showed up in ancient Greece, apparently. It's reported by Herodotus. Is it Herodotus? No, by someone, I've forgotten. Arian, maybe.
Okay.
And they call gymnosophists because
Yes.
they wear very little clothes. Okay, gymnosophists. They're basically naked saints. And the Greeks said to them, prove to us that you really believe in your philosophy. And both of them, one after another, self-immolated to prove. And the Greeks were so shocked that they actually recorded my last name in their history. So with that connection, with that gory thought, I'd like to open it up for questions. Professor, if you could use the mic.
You put a lot of knowledge on there.
Yes.
Yeah, it's up. Go ahead. Yeah.
You put a lot of knowledge on their great history. We were the greatest, and I keep hearing this. We originated a lot of knowledge. And if our objective was to transform, what the hell happened?
What the hell happened to the transformation part? Well, for a while it happened.
32, 33% GDP, we were top of the world.
Right. So again, look, Peter de Monte, the historian of Rome, who wrote in German, I think in 1980, he said he made a list of every cause that had been attributed to for the fall of Rome. He listed 210 of them. So that is not going to be an easy answer. I have some thoughts, but the short answer is, I think the short answer is that the reason why these universities were destroyed is because they became defenseless. And it's a sad story that when they were destroyed, it took only 200 horsemen to destroy a community of 10,000 people who came literally 1,000 miles to do that. So ultimately, that was the proximate cause. But the longer answer is, of course, much deeper. And we can have a very long discussion on that.
I think perhaps our 200 horsemen is going to be global warming. We'll find out. Right. Other questions? Christine?
Thank you. That was, is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay.
It's only for the recording.
Okay, thank you. That was a great talk. So, so I guess there's a lot of evidence that shows the translation of the European university to the U.S. Is there any evidence that shows the translation of those concepts from the Indian to the European system?
No, none. In fact, as far as I know, there was none. That once these universities were destroyed, they were destroyed. And the knowledge of those essentially did not even remain in India. So even India was unaware of it. And until the ruins of Nalanda were excavated, we didn't even know. These were only concepts that people had read from travelogues, so there was not even a physical counterpart. But what is truly interesting is that the knowledge survived in the Chinese traditions. In fact, what is interesting is that Professor Gay of Beijing University sent me 40 pages of references in the Chinese tradition that only 24 people in the whole world can read, because it is ancient Buddhist technical Chinese, half of whom only write in Japanese. So, so a lot of it, surprisingly, still remains to be uncovered. But except for the hard evidence, that is the archaeological and the epigraphic evidence, none of it survives in India. So it's not surprising that very little of it, nothing as far as I know, found its way into Europe. What it did do is that it found its way into Tibet, into China, into Japan, into Korea. Many universities were set up in each of these locations with direct input from Nalanda or Vikramshila. So, but not to the west. To the east, absolutely huge evidence. In fact, at least 12 ancient university systems were based on Nalanda, including the Mongolian system, I'm told. So all of those were there. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for so detailed and deep study with the counter reference of so many literatures. It's a great knowledge to all of us.
Thank you.
One question to that, when you look at it, the university wants to transform. At the same time, when you look at the history, breakthrough technology innovation makes somebody at the top to the complete go very quickly at the bottom, because Galileo was thinking different way than what it is now. So how that university interaction with that breakthrough technology, if you're living in that same number one all the time and thinking number one, while somewhere remote, and which is history is evidence of that, is doing completely different thing and change the whole concept of education.
So I think that goes back to the previous question. Again, very, very complicated dynamics. I would be very wary of giving you a single factor answer. A whole series of things basically came to the fore. I think a lot of it had to do with how defenseless the society became for a variety of reasons. That nobody was there to stop 200 horsemen from rampaging over several thousand miles. But at the end of the day, it is also very clear that by the 12th century, a lot of dynamism was being lost. So that was, as it were, the final blow when these universities were destroyed. But for several hundred years, the dynamism was going for a variety of reasons. And the long-term view is that unless a society, unless an ecosystem constantly renews itself, there are always forces that will overtake it. And if the gap becomes too great, then forces start to move in a particular direction.
My question relates to MOOCs.
Yes.
And so on the one hand, the MOOCs could be, the next level of competition among universities, and
Right.
it could be, now a global and internet scale competition. And really the question is it could be that this competition could create sort of a winner-takes-all market. That is, we maybe we'll have dozens of calculus courses and dozens of philosophy courses
Right.
and dozens of everything else, but one of those will be the best one, and the whole market goes that way. And when I say market, maybe there'll be some way to monetize all this, and literally the riches go in that direction, and everybody else loses out. And so, couldn't this in fact be a very destructive power for universities? How do you think about that in the long term?
Let me share a funny story with you. When I was Sanjay mentioned that I was educated in Delhi, right, for my first degree. The textbook that we used was Samuelson's Economics, the same textbook that was being used at MIT. Did I get an MIT education by using that textbook? No. And in fact, the textbooks were the MOOCs of their time. And they've been around for hundreds of years now. And I actually attended Samuelson's lectures here. I came across the road, as it were, or came down the road to attend his lectures, and it was a very different thing from his textbook, which in any case was an undergraduate textbook. So I think that aspect of MOOCs is completely overblown. That is to say, it does not represent, in my view, a disruption from that point of view. But I will tell you where I think it represents a disruption. It represents a disruption in the way in which you're able to assess people at large scale, the way in which you're able to grade people at large scale, and more importantly, have them collaborate at scale. So I think if I were to put on my futurist hat, I would say we have to think a lot more about how people can collaborate using a MOOC environment. But for that, you would also have to do something that the universities have been very good at doing ever since Takshila, and especially since Vikramshila, the 6 Dwar Pandits, is you will certainly have to sort the students by passion and ability, so that when you create these online groups, you have reasonable certainty that they will continue and that they will fire each other up. It's a big challenge. But until and unless you are able to transform, again, remember, this is not just about educating individuals. You want to transform them by changing their way of thinking. It's not just giving them a better way to solve a calculus problem. It is the whole perspective that a great teacher gives you, and which very often students working in groups give to themselves. You see, you're a bright student, I'm in your group, I see you ace and crack this problem, I saw your thinking, I say, I can do it too. I think that is where MOOCs will be very powerful. But I think, let me put it this way, we've not put in enough thinking to really release the full potential of MOOCs. So in sum, I would say that it is not the large scale, it is not just the fact that you can do MOOCs and that 200,000 people can take a course. Well, they could do that even in my time when I was in graduate school or in college. 200,000 people could read Samuelson's textbook. After that, there was the radio. Remember, there were correspondence courses. People thought that the postal service would revolutionize education because, professors could send their best lecture notes to you, right? 1890s, that was the big thing. Then it was radio. Then it was TV. All of these basically were taken to be the next big thing. Now, unlike those, I believe MOOCs have a potential to actually do something that they were not able to do, which is to connect people. See, remember, it's a two-way thing now. These were one way. So the potential that needs to be harnessed is not the scale of MOOCs, but the two-way transformative character of MOOCs. But for that, you'd have to go back. Remember what I had in the slide. I'm sorry. Oops. You'd have to focus very clearly on these three things: the selection, the support, and the transformation. So if I were to summarize the 22 factors, it is one or the other of these. And how one looks at these, I think, will ultimately determine
So in the interest of time, I think Philip has the mic. Philip, why don't you ask your question, and then we will end the live session, and we'll be here for a few minutes if you'd like to come and ask Shilin the different topics.
Thank you. Thank you also for this framework, which I thought was really useful in thinking about all these different perspectives. One thing that struck me, that was surprising to me, is that you only added things. So there was the Indian tradition, then the European tradition added additional points to your framework, and then the US added further things. So I was curious, didn't it also take out some? And in particular, the dimension that I'm maybe most interested in is in the last 100 years, it strikes me that the university has fundamentally changed the role it plays within society and has become much more entrepreneurial, maybe as one term, Bayh-Dole Act.
Yes.
Is it still playing the same important social role that it has played in the past, or should it still be playing this role? How is that role changing? Kind of what are you seeing in this last century?
Well, by the way, the short answer to your first question, I believe there are two questions, is that as far as I could tell, they only added things. They reinvented things. Now again, it is I don't have the competence to go back to the original European sources, the Italian, the French, the German, to figure out exactly what were the nuances, but at least at a first glance, it seems that the same set of problems are being solved in almost the same order. Because like with Takshala, they start as a co-location of scholars. There's no overarching, and it's privately paid for. That is, each student brings his own pile of money, goes to a teacher and says, teach me. And the students get together and, organize, and then the faculty organize, and then the university is gradually born. It's the same process in Takshala. Then the same process of the monastic rules being brought in, the same process of the king then regulating these institutions, then the public funding, then the grants, then the scientific, the knowledge creation process, the corporatization, etc. All of these things. Now, when you're talking about the transformation, yes, I think if anything, the universities are playing a much more active role in society today, partly because it is the knowledge society, but also for another reason, which is the fact that in India also, there are more women at all levels of education, more girls and women at all levels of education, even in India today, almost getting there at the postgraduate level, almost getting there. And of course, in the US, that has been true for some time, that women outnumber men in the university system as a whole. So what is it doing? It is creating actually huge inequalities, because remember, I remember when I was growing up, there were these doctor-nurse romances that were being sold at newsstands. You don't see that anymore. Doctors don't marry nurses anymore, because there were no women doctors, so they married nurses. Today, doctors marry other doctors. Today, because women are out there achieving, high achievers marry other high achievers. So the assortative process, the selection process, has become very unequal. It is creating, the universities are at the heart of it. We are the ones who are creating this process. The whole Piketty kind of argument. A big part of it, I'm sure, a big part being played worldwide in exacerbating inequalities, is that smart women and smart men are getting together in a way that was never possible before, because women were not realizing their full potential earlier. Women were not really players at an equal level with the men. So it has some consequences for inequality, I would like to believe. So if anything, we have to think about these issues even harder than we have ever done before, because I think not only are we in many ways part of the solution, because we are incubating all these cool technologies. And I can tell you as an entrepreneur, as somebody who teaches entrepreneurship courses and who founded a company and is involved with several more right now, there has never been a more exciting time for knowledge creation and transformation, right? Transformation of knowledge into actual impact and products. So in many ways, for both of those reasons, good and bad, the university is a much more important part of the ecosystem. Also, for the reason that a far larger percentage of the population is now educated or has access to higher education. So the burden that we have is even higher.
Shilin, thank you very much.
Thank you.